but I find 1-star reviews on Amazon quite entertaining. This one, Jacob found a really long time ago and said to me, and it still makes me laugh. Sometimes when I'm feeling a bit stressed, like maybe when you suddenly find yourself back in lockdown again when you were expecting it. I go back to things like this and they make me laugh. Context is not everything, but it's pretty essential. And when we don't have context, or if we misunderstand the context, like maybe this person has, or maybe they did understand, but they were being deliberately funny. Either way, I'm amused. It can lead us to false beliefs and expectations and assumptions. A number of years ago, not many years ago, I joked a few weeks ago that all my illustrations are starting to get really old because I'm getting really old. But this one's actually not too long ago. One of the things that some of you will be aware that one of the things I've done for quite some time now is that I'm on our national movement that Wesleyan Church's Global Ministerial Development. And so one of the things that I get to do as part of that is walk alongside people who are going on this journey towards, from the point where they start thinking about maybe going into ministry to eventually being ordained. That is actually driving me crazy. Is that better? Or should I just switch mics? Because that's not good here now, isn't it? You've turned it off. Right, we're going to get rid of that. No, I'm all good. I'm all good. Cool. So it's a real privilege to be able to do that. Once a number of years ago, we had someone coming through who was at a point in their journey, and decisions needed to be made about whether or not they were going to progress onto the next stage. And so there were a group of people that were tasked with talking to this person about, how they were feeling and whether they were ready to move on. And as a result of the conversation, they came back and said, oh, this person isn't ready. It's clear they don't feel ready. And there were a number of people who were like, I'm a bit unsure about that. And after quite a lot of discussion, what we realised is that the group that were asking questions and the person that was being asked questions had some different cultural assumptions and expectations about how we ask questions and answer them in certain contexts. And it meant that they came to this misunderstanding about where this person felt that they were at. And so we had to go back and clarify with them, and then thankfully they progressed on and eventually were ordained. So often our unchecked assumptions, and in this case unchecked cultural assumptions, can lead us to misunderstand somebody, and it can be in situations that are really unimportant, and it can be in situations that are actually a really big deal, and that can lead to a huge amount of hurt. Thankfully, in this case, we were able to actually clarify that, and it didn't go badly. When we don't have a full or clear picture of a situation or of someone's behaviour or of their response to something, we fill in the gaps in our brains, just to try and make sense, to try and make order. We rationalise from our past experiences, from other things that might have happened in particular relationships, both good things and bad things. And we write our own story about what is happening. This is how we end up, not always, but quite often, with rumours. And it's how we end up with conspiracy theories a lot of the time. They're not generally someone who sits down and thinks, I'm going to mislead everybody. Sometimes, but not always. Often it's people trying to fill in the gaps, trying to make sense. But it also plays a part in our everyday interactions with our friends, with our family, with work colleagues. When someone speaks or acts in a way that we don't understand, generally speaking, they're not doing it. We're not doing it because we're terrible, shallow people. Or that we're not interested in reality, or because we would prefer to think badly of people. Assumptions are our brain's way of trying to make sense of something that is otherwise confusing to us or isn't clear. We make assumptions about things all the time, and often it saves us time. Jacob often makes assumptions about what we might need from the supermarket on his way home. It generally saves us time. Sometimes he clarifies those assumptions via text. Not always. It generally ends well, occasionally badly. Assumptions can help us, and they're not all bad. But the problem is when we make assumptions in our relationships with people, be it with friends, work colleagues, family members, our spouse, is that our experiences are often very different. And when we make assumptions about someone's behaviour or actions, we often get it wrong because people are incredibly complex. And complexity leads to unpredictability. And because we can't see all of the variables that are at play, we regularly, despite our best efforts, get it wrong, and we don't make sense to each other. Even people that we know quite well, and occasionally, even to ourselves. False assumptions or unclarified expectations start determining how we view someone else's behaviour. Distance stretches out between us, or another group of people that we're interacting with. We lose trust. We become disconnected. It's like throwing a ball of wool into a vat of dye without unravelling it first, and not knowing that there are other colours underneath that first surface layer. We over-dye the yarn with our own shades, not giving the other person a chance to set us straight. In the book of Exodus, we find God's people roaming about in the desert, looking for a place to call home. And as the story progresses, we find them grappling with what it means to love God and to love each other, to live in community with each other. So to help them out, God gifts them with some guidelines that we call the 10 Commandments, to give them some clarity. Now, amongst those commandments is this one: you shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. Now, in its original context, this verse is talking very specifically about willfully giving false evidence or testimony in court. But later in the Old Testament, in the book of Hosea, during an angry tirade against the people of God, the prophet Hosea enlarges this meaning of false witness and also includes deception. And then if we truck along a bit further into the New Testament and we look at the way that Jesus approaches the 10 Commandments in the Gospel stories, we find further expansion. What happens in the life of the mind becomes equated with real life actions. Similarly, violent words are likened to violent acts. So the passage that we heard earlier from Matthew's Gospel as part of a series of Jesus' teachings that we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. And it begins in Matthew 5 with a succession of blessed be statements. And then it shifts through a whole wide range of topics, from murder, adultery, giving, prayer, worry, fasting, judging others, and a whole bunch of other things. It's pretty broad in its scope. And it can seem a little bit like a bunch of disconnected teachings thrown together, but there are common threads that hold these little teachings together. They are all part of one whole. Jesus is laying out a holistic approach to spirituality and the life of faith, where belief and life, the mind and action, are one. One of the themes that runs through these bite-sized teachings is hypocrisy. Those who are more concerned with upholding an appearance of correct behaviour than with the hard work of transformation. So Jesus isn't saying, don't pray, don't fast, don't do good deeds, and don't correct others when they've got it wrong. But instead he's saying, don't make a point of doing these things for the sole purpose of illustrating how right you are. The passage about judgment follows in the same pattern. Love and correction isn't what's at issue. Jesus is shining a light on those who are more concerned with pointing out others' faults than with exploring where God is working in their own life. Those who are using defining what is right as a veil to cover a lack of alteration in their own heart toward God and others. Judging others can serve as a way of deflecting our attention away from where God's working in us. If we're busy focusing on somebody else's failures, we become blind to the need to make space for God to work in areas of brokenness in our own life. And judgment can take many forms. When we make assumptions about what someone else thinks, believes, or feels, or if we hold someone to expectations that they've never agreed to, we can quickly find ourselves falling into judgment. We are choosing to believe something about that person that isn't accurate or fair. So this passage on judgment comes directly after a really well-known passage about worry. And the focus of that text on worry and anxiety is about money and material safety, having food to eat, water to drink, clothes to wear, a roof over our head. And concern and fear about those are definitely things that have kept me awake at night at times. But the worry that has lost me the most sleep is when there is conflict in relationships in my life. Conflict in relationships that I care about. So whether it's with a work colleague, a friend, a family member, the temptation to roll over and over an interaction in your mind, to start imagining they must have been thinking this, and imagining scathing comebacks, different outcomes, high risk, if you're me. Imagining an interaction with someone that we are in conflict with can actually be a healthy way of processing how we feel, because it can help us get to the heart of what is going on in the relationship from our perspective. And it's that last bit. It can help us to get a handle on how we're thinking and feeling. But there is a point where it shifts from being beneficial to becoming obsessive and destructive. I don't know, have you been there? I've been there. The mind starts ticking and it just keeps on going. And for me, it's usually about when I start imagining myself winning the interaction with a particularly sharp or witty comeback, one-liner. When I become more interested in winning and saying something clever than in listening or in repairing that relationship. That's the point where I shift from healthy processing to unhealthy judgment. So what do we do? How do we open up conflict so that both parties can openly clarify their thoughts, feelings, and expectations? Well, first, we have to recognise that we've actually made an assumption, or that maybe we've got an expectation that the other person doesn't share. So it takes a bit of self-reflection to be able to look and go, what assumptions and expectations am I holding here? So the first bit is to recognise. The next bit is to re-evaluate. Once we've realised that we're holding some assumptions and expectations, are my assumptions and expectations accurate? Are they fair? Are they reasonable? Have I ever talked to the other person about them? Quite an important question. We need to actually verbally speak our assumptions, and so that they're no longer assumptions, so they're actually out there. And then once we've got to that point where we've recognised, we've re-evaluated, then we can re-engage in that relationship. And to do that, we want to clarify the assumptions that we have. But before we can actually jump in with a person and try and clarify expectations or our assumptions that we think that they might hold, we need to first create a safe space for both parties so that they can share how they really feel and what they really think. Otherwise, we just end up with more deflection, evasion, misunderstanding, hurt. So if people don't feel they can actually really honestly tell you, then they won't. And so you just end up with with more hurt in a relationship. So before we open up a conversation, we have to consider, what is it that I'm wanting for myself in this interaction? What is it that I want? What is it that I want for other people? And what is it that I want for this relationship? So when we ask ourselves those questions, we start getting to the heart of what's the purpose for us, and to help us to find common ground that we might share with that person. To have hard conversations where both parties feel safe to talk, we need to begin from a place of mutual respect and purpose. So regardless of the context, we need to find common ground that both parties care about nurturing, and hold that at the centre of our conversation. So, here's what not to do. You're concerned that you're doing all the work on a project that you're supposedly working on with someone at work. And here's how the interaction could go. You aren't following through on any of the tasks of this project. I'm doing all the work. You need to start pulling your weight. You obviously don't care about how much extra work I'm doing to make this happen. These might be valid feelings, but probably not the most helpful way to express it. A different approach. I know this project is important to both of us, and I want it to succeed. Can we talk about how it's progressing? I understood that you would complete X, Y, Z, and while I would work on A, B, and C. Is that correct? Is that what you thought? So first, we establish mutual purpose, common ground, something we agree on. And then we look for clarity, but we try and be as specific as we can about what our assumptions are or our expectations are. Establishing mutual purpose or coming to mutually agreed on expectations is not a technique. It's not a technique whereby with trickery, skill and manipulation, we trick people and get them to share what our expectations are. Very tempting, not helpful. If it's the truth that we're looking for, if we're really actually wanting to get to what is the common ground we really truly share, we have to genuinely care about the other person's interests, and that means recognising and respecting differences. If our desire for truth is greater than our desire to be right, we have a much better chance of hearing the other person and finding some common ground. Truth is the light in the room that shines in every dark corner. It's the ball of wolves unravelling to reveal every tiny shift of colour. We will not always agree with each other, but we can find common ground if we adjust our expectations to respect other people's beliefs and boundaries. And we're actually going to talk more about how we do that well as we progress in this series. There's something I'd like to push it back on a little bit, particularly for those of you who are following along this series in the Emotionally Healthy Relationships workbook. It's one of the statements that's made several times is, expectations are only valid if they are mutually agreed upon. Now, in principle, I agree with this. In most instances, we do need explicit, mutually agreed on expectations of others. But there are some expectations of the behaviour of others that are reasonable and valid and don't require explicit agreement. For example, it is reasonable for me to expect that you will not hit me because you are angry. Reasonable, valid, doesn't require explicit agreement. It is reasonable for me to expect that you will not verbally abuse me. Reasonable, valid, does not require explicit agreement from the other person. Now, in fairness to Pizza Zero, this is not what he has in view, but he makes an absolute statement, and I think it's unhelpful. particularly given that the church doesn't have a pristine track record, or even a particularly good one, for protecting those who are most vulnerable to harm amongst us. So I want to be clear, because I think we need to be. In most cases, yes, we need to check our expectations, we need to check our assumptions are reasonable and explicitly mutually agreed on. But when we're talking about physical or verbal harm, then we have a different problem, and these rules do not apply. If that is you, please reach out for help. If we have a confidential email address that you can contact our pastoral team, support@session.org.nz, and we're going to put up some links to some other sites that you can access if that is something that you need. Resetting the patterns in our relationships is really hard work. I'd love to tell you that there's like this magic trick you can do and they'll be really easy, but it's not true. Change is more often than not painfully slow. A lack of progress can feel really disheartening. And it often comes with ups and downs, you know? We go through this big high of change, and then it's just like nothing for ages. Or it's this tiny inching forward, and it feels like we're just not getting anywhere. It can feel really disheartening. We cannot always see what is going on underneath the surface. Sometimes, when we least expect it, the signs of new growth suddenly appear. Back in 2010, 2 feijoa trees were planted in our garden. And every year they would slowly and steadily grow, but slowly, very slowly, creeping growth. And we would study them very carefully because I was very excited about the idea of feijoas. So every year it would be looking for the blossoms. Get to it until about October, be knocking. And our neighbours have like these amazing, really, really abundant feijoa trees. So I'd always see when theirs were starting to blossom, I'd be like, look, are they coming? And for 7 years, we saw none, not a single blossom. At about year 5, I consulted my neighbour with the abundant feijoa trees, who is a very adept gardener. And I got him to come and have a look at our trees. And he checked them over and said, yep, they're healthy, they're growing, they're doing what they do. They're just not mature yet. Just gotta give them some time, they'll get there. Seriously? So he assured me that every tree was just a little bit different, and feijoa trees can take a really long time to grow from seedlings. And we would just have to wait. So after 7 years, one of our trees began to sprout buds. Promise of fruit. It was not an abundant harvest. I think that first year we got 3 feijoas, so we were so excited about them. And however many years on it is now, I think it's about 4 years on from there, we get feijoas. I wouldn't say that those trees are thriving per se, but they are growing, and every year there is more fruit, there are more blossoms. This year it's looking like our best harvest ever, and I am so excited. There was little that we could do to speed up the process. There was literally nothing we could do to speed up the process. It happened in its own time. And we couldn't see what was happening underneath the ground. We couldn't see what was happening inside the roots or the branches. We had to simply wait and trust that in time it would be a fruit. As difficult as it is, we need to let the winter do its work before things can blossom fruitfully in the spring. I came across a post on Instagram a couple of days ago actually, which I think sums this up beautifully. I think sometimes in a world that promotes overnight success, we forget that some of life's greatest victories come when we surrender to the in-between of waiting to bear fruit. surrender to the in-between of waiting. Transformation is not always evident on the surface. I think that's why God is way less concerned with appearances than we are. The hard, deep work of change takes time, and it's not immediately apparent until suddenly, unexpectedly, it blooms. When it comes to relationships, we will often get it wrong, but we keep practicing. We stay humble and open to transformation and change. Because this is what true discipleship looks like. It is not the outward appearance of rightness or perfection, but it is the inward commitment to growth and change.